Friday, we finish off the book of Joshua. So it's, as you might expect, if we're completing Joshua chapter 24, and just those last verses 29 through 33. I might be in the minority here, maybe more in that 8:15 service would agree with me on this, but I find reading obituaries fascinating. Now, there might be just an element of it at my age. I turn 60 tomorrow. And as I go back to I'm from Middlesboro, Kentucky. I go back to the Middlesboro Daily News, which is on it has a web page. I go back, click the obituaries, and read through them about twice a month. Because I'm at this age, there are more and more people that I grew up with, that I went to school with, or that were not far ahead of me, whose names are starting to show up in those obituaries. And I don't know why it makes me feel better, but I like to know when somebody that I've known has died, and I'll read that obituary every time. We can find out a lot in an obituary. I mean, two of the most important dates in your life we know when we read an obituary: the date of birth and the day that they died. Of course, we also know that life is lived in between those 2 days. And I also know how difficult it is to capture the spirit, the essence of someone's life in like 200 words, but that's what we try to do in an obituary. And so I'll read obituaries of people I don't even know. And I'm just looking for what kinds of things were important to them. Like, where did they go to school? What kind of work did they do? What sports teams did they cheer for? But I really start to look, usually it's near the end of the obituary, where it will say something about their faith, maybe what church they were a member of, maybe the pastor who will be doing the service. That's what I'm really interested in. That's where I think you find out what's really important in a person's life. You might find out what gave them joy. You might find out what made life remarkable for them. What was it that got them up every day to go into their day and their life? These are the things I look for in an obituary. I find them fascinating. But the narrative that Joshua has given us about entering the land, conquering the land, and allotting the land, that it would end with 3 obituaries, demands the question, why? It's not quite the ending I would have expected. And it's not just the ending, the beginning of Joshua. Look back at Joshua chapter 1. It started with a funeral. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. That's where we started, with a funeral. Now we end with 3 obituaries. Why? Is it just so that people can know how the story ended for these characters? You know, like maybe you go to a movie at the end, whatever happened after the film ended, it'll put some types up there to tell you, what happened, when they got out of jail, or when they died, or where they were buried, or something like that. Is it just to give us more information, to fill out things at the very end? Or maybe it's so the family down the line, descendants, can know where they're buried. Maybe it's so that they can know where to go to decorate for Veterans Day or Memorial Day, or those kind of days where you might want to go decorate someone's grave site. It's got to be more than that. I would read all 3 of these, beginning in verse 29, as a theological obituary. These are about these people, yes, but there's something more here. It's not really about them, it's about God's faithfulness to them, even in death. So let's start here at verse 29. After these things, the Lord's servant Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. They buried him in his allotted territory at Timnath-serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Gash. And Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works the Lord had done for Israel. Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the parcel of land Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver. It was an inheritance for Joseph's descendants. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, which had been given to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim. So let's look at each of these three obituaries and note not only their death, but also their life. So let's start with the first one, the faithfulness of God in the life and death of Joshua. Verses 29 through 31. 29 says, after these things, the Lord's servant, Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. So before we get to Joshua's death, let's just think again about his life and how God had been faithful to him throughout his life. When he first shows up in Exodus 17, he's leading the Israelites against the Amalekites. Now that's that unusual battle where Moses is holding up his arms, but Joshua's actually leading the troops down in the valley, and he leads them to victory. So God had called him to lead them in that battle, and God was faithful to him, and they overcame and defeated the Amalekites. The next time we see him is Numbers chapters 13 and 14. That's where Moses chooses 12 spies to go into the land to make a determination about whether they should go take it now. Having left Mount Sinai, go directly from Mount Sinai into the promised land. And most of you will recall that only 2 spies said, yes, we can, and one of those was Joshua. And because of that, God makes the determination that Moses will not be the one who leads them into the land because he struck a rock. It's a long story. Moses isn't going to be the one who leads them in. It's going to be Joshua. And we start to hear that here in Numbers 13 and 14. It's actually Numbers 14, 30, and 31. I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. I will bring your children whom you said would become plunder into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. So immediately after saying, yes, we can, and the other 10 said, no, we can't, and so the people decided not to do it, immediately God says, you all aren't going in, but Joshua and Caleb will, and Joshua will lead you. In Deuteronomy 1, that was Numbers 14, Deuteronomy 1, 37 through 39, this is what God says to Moses. Joshua, son of Nun, who attends you, who is your assistant, will enter it, that is the land. Encourage him, for he will enable Israel to inherit the land. Your children, who you said would be plunder, your sons, who do not yet know good from evil, will enter there. I will give them the land, and they will take possession of it. Again, Joshua is the one who will lead them in. In Deuteronomy 3, 27 and 28, again, God says to Moses, go to the top of Mount Pisgah, look to the west, the north, the south, the east, and see the promised land with your own eyes, for you will not cross the Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will cross ahead of the people and enable them to inherit the land that you see. And then Moses summons Joshua in Deuteronomy 31. This is just before the book of Joshua opens. Deuteronomy 31, 7 and 8. Moses then summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you will go with this people into the land the Lord swore to give to their ancestors. You will enable them to take possession of it. The Lord is the one who will go before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or abandon you. Do not be afraid or discouraged. And if that sounds familiar from what we've been doing here over the last week since the beginning, I guess, January, it is. Because then in the book of Joshua, at the opening, Joshua chapter 1, verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you will distribute the land I swore to your ancestors. Joshua 1:7, above all, be strong and courageous. And Joshua 1:9, haven't I commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Exactly what he had said in Deuteronomy 31 that Moses should say to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go, and you will lead these people to take possession of this land. And that is precisely what God did through Joshua. We follow the story for 24 chapters. God being faithful to his word. God doing exactly what he told Joshua that he would do. With Joshua every step of the way. It's more than just God was with Joshua in his death, which we're finding here at the end at verse 29. It's that God was with Joshua every day of his life. And he continues to be with him in death. Now, when we come to verse 29, after these things, after all these things, after crossing the Jordan, after making preparation and building a memorial on the other side of the river, after taking the city of Jericho and Ai, and defeating the kings of the north and the south, after allotting the land to the 12 tribes, after giving them farewell speeches, after all these things, the Lord's servant, Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. Now that might not sound like there's anything worth noting particularly there. I mean, yeah, he's 110 and he died. Look at the designation that he receives here. The Lord's servant, Joshua, son of Nun. This is the phrase, the servant of Yahweh. You might notice, if you think back to all that we've done, it's Moses who's been called the Lord's servant. 17 times in the book of Joshua, Moses is called the Lord's servant. Twice in the first two verses. Joshua 1, I read it earlier, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant. The Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. And then he starts in verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. 17 times in the book of Joshua, Moses is called the Lord's servant. Repeatedly in Joshua, whenever Joshua is given a title, he's son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Now I'll say, without hesitation today, that's a high, if you're making business cards and you're able to put assistant of Moses on there, that's pretty good. But that's not like saying you're the servant of Yahweh. I mean, you might be on the next line of the organizational chart when you say, well, I'm Moses' assistant, but there's a Grand Canyon between Yahweh's servant and Moses' assistant. This story's not about Moses. This story's about Joshua leading the people into the land by the power of God who fought for them. And yet, it's Moses who's the Lord's servant until this moment. And now, finally, in death, he has earned the title servant of Yahweh. And maybe it's just me, but I want to stand and give him an ovation. I want to celebrate. It's like, I don't know if it ever bothered him or crossed his mind, but I'm just happy for him that here at the end, now he's elevated to the same level of Moses. Now he's also servant of Yahweh. What a great thing to be said, that you were servant of Yahweh. And that's what is said of Joshua in the end. There's only 4 people in Scripture who are designated servant of Yahweh: Moses, David, Eliakim, and now Joshua. That's a pretty elite group, and Joshua is now in it. And they buried him, look at verse 30, they buried him in his allotted territory at Timnath-serah in the hill country of Ephraim. The precise location, or close to it, is provided for us, but the most important thing is that they buried him in the promised land. They didn't take him back to somewhere where his parents might be buried, or somewhere where he was born, or back to Egypt, or somewhere in the wilderness. They buried him in the promised land, the place that his entire adult life had been focused on gaining entrance into, even going back to the day when he was a spy going into the land. It was so important to the patriarchs. That's Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the matriarchs. That's Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah. It was so important to them to be buried in this land, not the land they came from. In Genesis 23, the first of the matriarchs dies. It's Sarah. And it's the story of 2 verses about her death. Genesis 23, 1 and 2. She dies and Moses mourns. She'd been a faithful wife. He mourns. But then 18 verses describe his effort to gain a plot of land in the promised land so he could bury her there. He did not own any land in the promised land. It was not his. They did not own land there, so he had nowhere to bury her there. So it's 18 verses of him acquiring a plot of land, a cave, so she could be buried. And she's buried in the cave of Machpelah. And this becomes the cave of the patriarchs, it's called. Abraham will be buried there. Sarah is first buried there. Isaac is buried there. Jacob is buried there. Leah is buried there. Why was it so important? Because being buried in that land was an indication of their faith that one day God would give that land to their ancestors, just as he had promised Abraham. And to be buried in that land was to say, we believe. It was also to be like a token, a down payment, a guarantee, of first fruits of what was to come. We talk about at Easter, Jesus being a first fruit of the resurrection. By virtue of Jesus' resurrection, we can all anticipate we too will be raised from the dead. Well, if Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Leah and Rebekah are buried in the promised land, even before they have possession of it, while it's ruled by Canaanites, it's the first fruit. It says that the day will come when all of our descendants will live in this land. And so it's no small thing when it says in verse 30 that they buried him in the northern part of the promised land. If the success of a leader is gauged by how well the people carry on after he's dead, then I think we'd have to say at verse 31, Joshua was a successful leader in life and in death. It says in verse 31, Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works that the Lord had done for Israel. What happens when the leader dies? Do the people retreat? Do the people go back to their idols? Remember last week, he gave that final speech that took us right up to verse 29, where he said, be loyal to God, get rid of your idols. As for me and my house, we will worship the Lord. We will worship and serve him. This answers the question, what will they do? At least for a time, they will continue to be loyal to God. To just finish off the Joshua part of this story, he lives to be 110. Moses lived to be 120. And you could say, well, Moses got him one more time. He lived 10 years less. Moses got him by 10 years. He got to live 10 years longer. But just to round it out, Joshua was buried in the promised land. Moses never made it in the promised land in life or death. We learn in Deuteronomy 34, he's buried in an unknown grave on the other side of the Jordan. it was a good life. And Joshua was faithful, and God was faithful to Joshua. Then in verse 32, we get the faithfulness of God in the life and death of Joseph. Now, it seems really strange that suddenly we get something here about Joseph's burial. Verse 32, Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the parcel of land Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver. It was an inheritance for Joseph's descendants. Well, what difference does Joseph's bones make at this point? His story goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. So let's review a little bit of Joseph's story. He is the dominant figure in the book of Genesis outside of God. You think Abraham is, but he really only gets like chapters 12 through 22 or 23, 24. You think maybe it's Isaac. He only really has a very small role to play in terms of the amount of material that describes his life. Jacob pales in comparison to the amount of space given in Genesis to describe the life of Joseph. From Genesis 37 through 50, the text of Genesis is laser focused on the person of Joseph. Now, you know his story well, most of you do. It's a story filled with tragedy and hardship, and yet the Lord was with Joshua. Joseph. He was with Joshua too. But the important thing here is he was with Joseph. You think about what happens to him in his life. Already in chapter 37, we find out he's his father's favorite, but not his brother's. And maybe for good reason. But they betray him, sell him into slavery, to be betrayed by your brothers. He ends up in slavery in Egypt. But he overcomes it because we learn in Genesis 39, 4 times, the Lord was with Joseph. So it looks like he's overcoming all of this. And he's a servant in Potiphar's house. And then he's falsely charged with sexual assault, and he goes to prison again. And yet he ends up rising, getting out of prison, rising through the ranks, and coming to a position of great prominence, even second in command, in charge of grain distribution in a time of famine throughout the empire. Now that's the story of Joseph in life. And God was faithful to him. He was with him through the whole process, bringing him to this point, such that Genesis 50 can make the statement, you, my brothers, meant what you did for evil, but God meant it for good. That's a way of saying God is sovereign and God is faithful. He was faithful to Joseph throughout his life. And because of that, the family is saved from famine. Jacob and his brothers and their whole families end up in Egypt, preserved in the midst of a great famine. What a life. And then in death, we find out, and let's look now to Genesis 50, the last few verses. A lot of funerals today. Genesis 50, verse 24. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Now, he doesn't state it explicitly, but they know what he means. Carry his bones up from Egypt into the promised land when God gives you that land. Now, I doubt that Joseph had any idea that it would be 45 years or something like that before God would actually come to their aid and bring them up. And then actually 400 years of slavery before they finally leave Egypt, and then it'll be 45 more years. He could not have known how long this oath would take to be fulfilled. And yet, this was his dying request: bury me in the land. Now, what happens to Joseph's bones after he dies? Well, it doesn't say at the end of Genesis. There is one verse between Genesis 50, when he makes this request, and Joshua 24, one verse that makes a reference to his bones. And it's Exodus 13 and an oh, by the way reference. This is just a description of the route of the Exodus, the route that the people took. And Exodus 13:19 says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear a solemn oath, saying, God will certainly come to your aid, then you must take my bones with you from this place. But that's it. So what we might not have recognized, because the text didn't seem to be that particularly interested in it, is that when God finally raised up Moses to lead them out of slavery, those Israelites had preserved his bones for 400 years. And now, when God raises up Moses, they carry his bones through the Red Sea. Those bones are somewhere at Mount Sinai, where they're camped for a year when Moses goes up on the mountain. Somebody's carrying a bone box with Joseph's bones for 40 years in the wilderness. And now they're in the land, and I don't know when they buried him exactly, but we find out here Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in a parcel of land that Jacob had purchased from Hamor, son of Shechem. We read that in Genesis chapter 33. Now, for me, the fact that Joshua bears the title servant of Yahweh is like such a fitting end to that part of the story. The fact that Joseph's bones are now buried in the promised land brings the fitting ending not just to the book of Joshua, but to the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and now Joshua. That those bones are now buried in this land. It meant so much to them. And for Joseph, it was a statement of his faith that God would one day give them the land, so take my bones there. I don't know if you think very often about where you want to be buried. I promise you this, you think more about it at 60 than you do at 20. And even one of my sons has asked me, I don't think he thinks it's happening anytime soon, but he's asked me, where do you want to be buried? Because I'm a Kentuckian. I'll always be a Kentuckian. If you cut me, there's just a tinge of blue in my blood. I'll cry right here and now if somebody stands up and sings My Old Kentucky Home. I cry before the Kentucky Derby every year. They play My Old Kentucky Home. I'm tuned in to Kentucky Derby every year. I know I'm in a minority there in Oklahoma. I could care less about the horse race, but it's such a part of the state of Kentucky, and they sing or play My Old Kentucky Home, and I just weep. Maybe I want to be buried in Kentucky. I think about it. But do I want to be buried in Kentucky if my wife's still living and she's here, my sons and their families are here? I'm not decided yet. That's to be determined. But it matters. And I'm sure at the point when I have to make a decision like that, I'll think it's an important decision to make. Joseph thought it was. He wanted to be buried in the promised land, and he was. And it's a perfect ending to that whole story that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis and God's promise to Abraham. And if you can find that spot where Joseph's bones are buried, and it's not just Joseph, It's that the whole Joseph family, this becomes the burial site for them. If you can find that place, it would be a monument to the faithfulness of God. And then finally, we have Eleazar. He may be the least familiar to you of these three figures, but he's the chief priest throughout Joshua's time as leader. So verse 33 says, "And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, which had been given to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim." So now I want you to think about the faithfulness of God in the life and death of Eleazar. During Eleazar's life, God, he saw so much of what we've covered in our story of Joshua and before. He is the son of Aaron. Aaron, the great chief priest, the first of the chief priests. Aaron, who's the assistant to Moses. He's there with him as priest, Moses as leader of the people. And he had two brothers who were older than him, so they were in line to be the next chief priest. Their names were Nadab and Abihu, but they were incinerated by God because they offered an inappropriate offering. It was unholy fire that they used to make the sacrifice, and they died in that moment. And with their deaths, now Eleazar elevates to next in line to be the chief priest. And so when Aaron dies, Moses takes the priestly garments of his great friend and assistant. I mean, these garments were made skillfully by God's design. He takes those priestly garments and he gives them to Eleazar. And from that point forward, Eleazar becomes a companion and co-leader with Joshua like Aaron was to Moses. And God was faithful to Eleazar, and he did important things in our story. In Joshua chapter 14, verse 1, the Israelites inherited these portions that the priest Eleazar, Joshua son of Nun, and the family heads of the Israelite tribes gave them to inherit in the land of Canaan. When it came to the allotment of the land, the distribution of the land, which is just as important as taking the land, it was Joshua and Eleazar, and then a leader from each of the 12 tribes who were as part of that process. And then at 1951, when they're finished with the distribution of the land, we get one summary statement at the end. These were the portions that the priest Eleazar, Joshua son of Nun, and the family heads distributed to the Israelite tribes by lot at Shiloh in the Lord's presence in the vicinity of the tent of meeting. He was there. He was responsible, along with Joshua, for the casting the lot and determining who gets what. His name means God has helped. And God used Eleazar to help Joshua, and God helped Eleazar. It's a fitting name. And thus the death of Joshua and Eleazar marked the end of that generation of the conquest. They're marking the end of the conquest. Everything else after this is after the conquest. They mark a significant end with a question that lingers. What will Israel do now? Well, immediately we learn there, and as it talks about Joshua's death, that the people will continue to worship the Lord just as he called them to do. But the memory of Joshua will fade. Another generation will follow, and the question will be pressed again. What will these Israelites do? Who will they worship and serve? And the same question comes to us. We are 3,400 years after many of the events that are narrated here. We were not there for the crossing of the Jordan. We were not there to see the crumbling of Jericho. And yet the question remains, will we cling to the God who did those things? And in this 75th anniversary celebration, which comes to its climax next week, we're reminded about all those who've gone before us and what they've done in the building up of this church for 75 years. But you cannot escape the question, what happens next? Will you continue to serve the God of the people we've witnessed in these videos, going all the way back to Rupert Naney and Charlie Graves and Brian Waite and Hans Dilbeck and Stephen Rummage, who were the pastoral leaders with many others? These people have now been dead for several centuries, 3,000 years. They are dead, and yet they speak. And they speak of God's faithfulness. Thanks be to God.